This is John Daly speaking from the CBS newsroom in New York. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor from the air, and all naval and military activities on the island of Oahu, the principal American base in the Hawaiian Islands.
So it was that on December 7th, 1941, the United States was drawn into the Second World War. The conflict quickly spread to the Asia-Pacific region. Just months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan seized control of Singapore.
That is greeted in Australia with great concern and horror, but that is really saying that Britain, which is fighting the fight in Europe, cannot extend its military might to protect Australia.
That became even clearer when Japan set its sights on Australia. 4 days after the fall of Singapore, Japanese aircraft bombed Darwin. And in May 1942, their midget submarines attacked Allied ships in Sydney Harbour.
So there are attacks. These are real, these are tangible. And in some of the large cities like Sydney, like Melbourne, some children are evacuated into rural areas for their own safety.
There was never any intention on the part of the Japanese to invade Australia, but what they did want to do was to isolate us, to make it impossible for us to provide the resources to the United States that made it possible for the United States to maintain its military activities in the Southwest Pacific.
Australian forces were fighting across multiple fronts during World War II. Around 15,000 Australians became prisoners of war in Japanese camps across Southeast Asia, enduring brutal conditions that would mark families and communities for generations. But while Australian soldiers were fighting and suffering overseas, life back home was transforming in ways few had anticipated.
Second World War's a watershed for Australia. And I often think of it as being a marker between an older Australia, still very much embodied by its colonial roots, and then a new modern Australia.
Prime Ministers Robert Menzies and later John Curtin introduced sweeping new laws to support the war effort. Foods and clothing were rationed, with prices tightly controlled. Daylight saving was introduced to squeeze more working hours out of every day, and agricultural and industrial production were directed to meet military needs.
Everyday life is regulated in a way I don't think Australians have ever seen before or since. The Manpower Directorate is set up, and that had control of the working lives of all Australians aged from 16 up into their 60s, men and women. They registered with Manpower, they could be directed into certain industries, real control over where people worked and what they did.
Perhaps the most visible transformation came in the role of women. Around a third of Australian women joined the paid workforce, taking on jobs traditionally held by men who were away fighting. The Australian Women's Land Army replaced male farm workers, while other women filled factories and essential services across the country. The war didn't just change what Australians did, it fundamentally transformed how Australia saw itself and our place in the world. The fall of Singapore had made it crystal clear that Britain could no longer guarantee Australia's security. With American forces playing a critical role in the Pacific, Australia's strategic future became obvious.
So, of course, we turned to the United States, and we benefited enormously from that. Because what the United States ultimately wanted from Australia was not men. It didn't need soldiers. It had plenty of its own soldiers. What it needed was food, bases, R&R, support. That leads to the industrialisation of Australia in ways that have not been possible up until that point.
And there was another transformation happening at home. Australians, coming off the Great Depression, were able to build up savings during the war.
Because with rationing, goods and services are quite restricted. There's not that much to spend money on, and there's a lot of overtime in factories. So at the end of the war, there's a huge housing shortage, but a lot of Australian families do have a little bit of extra cash to move into a new post-war dream of suburban expansion and prosperity.
The Australia that emerged in 1945, economically stronger, strategically repositioned, and socially changed, was fundamentally different from the one that entered the war in 1939. World War II marked the end of Australia's colonial dependence, and the beginning of a modern, independent nation in the Pacific.